Come on up. Here's your. Right here. You're up.
All right.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thank you for having me, Rob. This is-
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, yeah.
Later.
Yeah. I will. Okay, I'll be done with you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Ken. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. And thanks to all of you for coming to join us tonight. And hopefully you'll find what I have to say interesting and helpful. If not, just throw vegetables. So what I want to do is, first I also have to say that, Rob, when he said he was going to give away door prizes, I got really excited because I could really use a door. But maybe I won't be eligible for the door. But I hope that you find this interesting. What I'm going to do is really talk about genetics, genetic predispositions in cancer, and our new department at Roswell, and how we aim and hope to be able to help lots of people, okay? Both at Roswell, their families, and in the general community as well. And what I would love is if you have questions, just feel free to ask, okay? And after the presentation, if any of you would be interested in helping, I'd love to have help, right? Because this is something for everybody. And if it's not for everybody, then we fail, right? And so anything I'd love, okay? So when I guess I'm done. There we go. There you go. All right. Mission accomplished. So when a person is diagnosed with cancer, there are really two questions that they ask. Right? First thing, right? Will I be okay? Will my kids be okay? What does this mean for my family? And when a person diagnosed with cancer asks those questions, what they're really asking about is their genetics and their gene sequences. And so let's talk a little bit about genes and gene sequences, right? So differences in our gene sequences explain the wonderful diversity and uniqueness that is each and every one of us. Similarities in our gene sequences that run within families explain traits that are shared within families. These, of course, are the red-headed Weasleys, and wizarding is real. I'm just saying. Okay. But sometimes in our genes, they can hold the key to wellness and illness in our family. This is Angelina Jolie, and this is an op-ed that she wrote in the New York Times in about 2013, in which she described the fact that breast cancer and ovarian cancer ran in her family. Breast cancer took her mom's life, and she herself learned that through genetic testing that she had an inherited predisposition to breast cancer and ovarian cancer. She was mindful of her mom and the fact that her mom never really got a chance to hug her grandchildren. And so Angelina decided that she would take action, take ownership, use that knowledge to ensure that she was around to hug her own grandchildren. And so she chose to have her breasts removed and her ovaries removed so that she could completely remove those risks of cancer. And that's really what this is about. This is about knowledge and empowerment, right? So let's think about genes and cancer, right? So this is just an example of chromosomes, right? Our genes live on chromosomes. The normal chromosomes, the normal genes that are in every cell of our body and are unchanged from when we're conceived until we pass away, is referred to as the normal or the germline gene. Okay, that's us, and it's unchanging. Our genes are our genes are our genes. Now, all a cancer cell is a normal cell that has acquired some changes that allow it to escape from normal regulatory control and divide unchecked. So here's a normal genome, and this is the same person's cancer genome, okay, from that person's cancer cells. And what you can see is that whereas in the normal genome, the person has 2 copies of chromosome 7, right, where some genes reside. In the tumor, the person has 3 copies of chromosome 7. And so what that suggests is that there's something in this person's cancer that resides on chromosome 7 that's important for the cancer progressing. So if we step back and we think about cancer risk, right, what we're really asking is, are there people who are predisposed to acquire these changes that allow their cells to break away from normal control and divide in an unfettered way? And if so, what are those changes? What is it that distinguishes people who acquire changes versus people who don't acquire changes? That's what cancer risk, cancer prevention, cancer genetics is all about. So before we start taking a deep dive into this whole field, let's go back and just think about the language, genes, and the logic of the genome, because this will help us sort of as we go forward, sort of understand the language and the logic of how the genome works, okay? So first, genes. Genes are the instructions for how our cells work, right? There are a total of about 22,000 genes. Again, they're exactly the same in every cell of our body, and they're made up of DNA, which are those pieces of A, C, T, and G that we learn about back in school, right? Genes are the instructions. They get transcribed into RNA, and then RNA gets translated into proteins, and proteins are the actual functional units of the cell. Okay, so that's the hierarchy, right? So genes are the instructions for proteins, and proteins do everything in our cells. Okay, now if we think about our gene sequence, our genome, right? It's comprised of, can you see this? It's comprised of 3 billion bases, 3 billion of these stretches of A, C, T, and G. Okay, the genes themselves are actually only about 1% of that entire real estate of our genome, right? And it's referred to as the exome, right? There's a total of 22,000 genes, okay? Of those 22,000 genes, only somewhere between 40 and 100 function to defend against cancer. So when we think about cancer risk, we're really not thinking about the entire gamut of 22,000 genes. We're really thinking about this subset of 40 to 100 genes that act to defend against cancer. Now, when we think about the organization of the genome, it's organized in chromosomes. We just saw that picture of normal chromosomes, cancer chromosomes from the same person, right? There are a total of 46 chromosomes. There are 22 pairs of what are called autosomes, right? Those are just numbered 1 through 22. And then there are the sex chromosomes. Women are XX, guys are XY. Now, it turns out that we don't have just 1 copy of every gene. We have 2 copies of every gene, one that we inherit from our mom and one that we inherit from our dad, okay? And so if we think about it, again, our genome is unchanging, right? What we get from our mom becomes half of our genome. What we get from our dad is half of our genome, 1 of each pair of every gene throughout the genome, okay? Now, while your genome is unchanging, and it's the same in every cell of your body from conception to death, and the same is true for me, if we compare the genomes between any 2 people, what we see is that there's variation. Maybe where I'm an A, you're a T, okay? And that's normal. And it turns out that each of us has about 10 to 30 million variants in our genome, okay? A variant, such as here, the C, right in the middle of this sequence, could be inherited from a person's mom, or it could be inherited from a person's dad. So if we have 2 copies of every gene, one from our mom, one from our dad, our parents each have 2 copies of every gene, we have a 50-50 chance of inheriting 1 copy or the other copy. That's just how the genome works, okay? So again, 10 to 30 million of these variants that exist in each and every one of these. So variation is the rule rather than the exception, okay? And just the name of variant is just called the minor allele. That's just its name, okay? And it's otherwise not important. It turns out that minor alleles, right, these variants, can either be common, so shared by a lot of people who we may or may not be related to, or rare, okay? If they're common, then they're found in more than 1% of the population. If they're rare, they're found in less than 1% of the population. And if we think about variants that are associated with an increased risk for cancer, they're actually very rare. They're found in less than 0.025% of a population. Does that all make sense? Okay. So let's think about variation at the level of populations, right? So you can imagine, where does a variant arise? Well, if you have a community that lives together and reproduces together, and there's someone who has a variant in that community, and there's reproduction going on within the community, then the variant gets propagated throughout the community, right? Populations that start elsewhere, right, may have different types of variations. So variants are actually reflections of ancestry, right? Your community, right? And in fact, this figure shows that very nicely. So these are genomes from individuals from a variety of different geographic locations and ethnicities. They were sequenced, and then variation in their genome was compared one to the next. And what you see is that individuals who are of African ancestry have similar spectrums of variation. Individuals who are of European ancestry have similar spectrums of variation, and individuals who are of Asian ancestry also have similar spectrums of variation, okay? So variants, yes.
Are they only broken up in those 3, or are there more?
So what you can see is that there's a continuum, right? And you can see that here as well. And what that reflects are populations that are mixed, right? Intermarriage, right? So these are ancestral populations, but people are people, and people as travel, right, has become easier through the generations, right? People intermix, and what you see is this continuum, right? So they're ancestrally important, but there is a continuum. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
And that becomes important because when you're doing a genetic experiment, what you need to do is compare like to like, right? You need to compare cases, right? People who have something in a certain ancestry group with controls from the same ancestry group. Because if you don't, if you compare European cases to African controls, then what you're going to get are differences, but those differences are just going to be reflections of ancestry rather than of associations with disease, right? Make sense? Yeah. And that's an incredibly important concept. So, again, thinking about variation, that's variation at the population level. This is variation at the family level, right? In families, variants can be passed along and can be associated with traits. This is what's called a pedigree, and we'll be using pedigrees later in the talk just to illustrate some points about inheritance and cancer risk, okay? So the important point here is that we have 3 generations of a family. We'll go into more detail later. We have 3 generations of a family: grandparents, parents, children, okay? The black circles represent a disease, right? In this case, it turns out to be breast cancer. And you can see that there's one person in this family, then there are two people in this family, and then there's a person in this third generation. So what we see is that there looks like a risk that's passed along from generation to generation, and we'll unpack that later, okay? But I just want to show you this concept right now of variance in families that can have effects in families, okay? And so if we think about variance, right, this is sort of thinking about them in populations and how they might be associated with risk. Along the x-axis here are common variants that are found in lots of people, and on the y-axis are the commonness of a variant. And on this axis over here on the y-axis is the contribution of a single individual variant to risk. Okay, and the idea is that if a variant is common, if a lot of people have a variant, it can't possibly be important for disease risk, because if it were, then every single person who had it would be dead, right? Or would have the trait that you're looking for, right? So common variants have low effects on disease risk. Rare variants can have large effects on disease risk, right? And when we talk about cancer risk and the genetic variants that we're looking specifically at rare variants that have large effects that are transmitted in families. Make sense? Okay. All right, so now let's talk about genetic testing. What is it all about and what can it tell us, right? So again, the theme is knowledge is power, right? Your genome doesn't care if you know or not, right? So you might as well know, because if you know, you can do something, right? And it turns out that in 2024, the information is incredibly useful and incredibly powerful. Knowing about an individual's genetic predispositions can be very important for families, right? And we can see families that have lots of people with cancer. Doing a genetic analysis can unlock the secrets, just like it did for Angelina's family, right? It turns out that knowledge of germline, so inherited genetics, can also be used to treat cancer patients. There's certain therapies that only work for people who have inherited predispositions and that actually take advantage of that Achilles heel of cancer cells to attack cancers.
I just have a quick question. Does it have to be like the same type of cancer for there to be that predisposition, or can it be different cancers?
Yeah, so that is a great question. And the short answer is that it's often different cancers. So just the best known example are the BRCA genes, like Angelina had what I think of as an off switch in a gene called BRCA1. Then what that does is it predisposed her and her family members to breast cancer, ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer, melanoma, and prostate cancer. Okay, so it's important for guys as well as for women, right? But so we know that there are spectrums of cancer types that are associated with different genes, okay? But what we don't know is why that is. Because if you think about it, the off switch that Angelina has in BRCA1 is in every cell of her body, and it was in every cell of her body from the moment she was one cell, from when she was conceived, until she became a real person, and it is that way throughout her life. So why is it that we're only talking about that small number of cancers rather than every cancer, right? And that's one of the $64,000 questions. We don't have the answer for why there's this dependency, right, of certain cancers and certain different types of genetic predispositions. It's completely unknown. But the point is that we can use the information to treat patients with cancers, right? These predispositions also point to vulnerabilities in cancers that the doctors can exploit with specific targeted therapies, okay? obviously, for family members of people who have something that's the same logic, right? Cancer prevention. If they haven't been diagnosed with cancer, this information can be used to keep them safe, right? And obviously for future generations as well. So if a person knows that they're predisposed, they can to cancer or other genetic conditions, they can use that information as part of family planning. And there's this, it's like Star Trek to me. There's this thing called PGD IVF, which is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis linked to IVF. And what it is let's say there's a woman who has a let's stick with the BRCA1 example, okay? A woman who has a BRCA1 off switch, right? What that means is that half of her eggs will have that off switch and half of them won't. But it's not possible to predict which is which. So a reproductive medicine doctor can harvest the eggs and then in the laboratory fertilize them with her partner's sperm, and then in a tissue culture dish using RPMI, grow the incipient embryo to 6 or 8 cells, and then take one cell, do a genetic test on that one cell. So remember, our genes, our DNA are the same from the moment that we're conceived until we pass away. And so if that one cell has the off switch in BRCA1, then we know that that embryo is going to have the BRCA1 off switch and be at high risk for breast cancer and so on. If, on the other hand, the embryo doesn't, then we know guaranteed, no questions asked, that the child that emerges from the union of that sperm and egg will not have that predisposition. And so the doctors can implant that fertilized egg, that embryo, and the family can have a baby that does not have that predisposition, guaranteed. It's crazy. It's like the stuff that they've been doing is unbelievable, right?
But you have to assume that they're looking for that particular.
You have to know what you're looking for. That's right. So, you know, the mother or the father, right, has to have a condition that can be looked for. That's exactly right. Although, to be honest, we're getting better at sequencing whole genomes from a single cell. So it's possible, something we do in a research setting, but it's not something that is ready for clinical use, okay? And that's important, right? Okay, but you know, things like PGD, IVF change the trajectory of families, right? It just changes things entirely, right? And so again, knowledge is power. And as we were just discussing, it's powerful for men as well as women, right? First, because there are conditions that men are predisposed to, you know, even for things that we think of as women-centered genetic predispositions. But guys have daughters, right? And if they have the predisposition, they have a 50% chance of passing along that predisposition to their daughters, right? So it's not just about women, right? You know, these predispositions matter for parents, for people, right? That's really important. So genetic testing, you know, as we've already alluded to, is not just looking for cancer risk, right? Identifying people very high risk for cancer so that we can work with them and their families to keep them safe, but it also is important for how we treat cancer. And this is just a list of cancers that have specific therapies that are based upon the presence of things like a germline, BRCA, or other off switch. Okay, so the point is that these are common cancers, and as we'll sort of go through later in the talk, if we think about my place, Roswell, well, guess what? 50% of all patients seen at Roswell have one of these 6 cancers, right? And so what that means is that genetics is not just for predisposition, but it's for treating as well. Half of all patients at Roswell, and that's a ton of people, right? So again, we're talking about keeping people safe through genetic knowledge, right? So what does that mean? So let's stick with the BRCA1 example. It's the theme of the night, I guess, right? So what do we do? If we identify a woman who has a genetic predisposition to cancer because of a BRCA1 off switch, there's a lot that we can offer. First, breast cancer surveillance, either through imaging, breast MRIs and mammograms, okay, alternating every 6 months. Or if a woman chooses to, remove the tissue at risk entirely, right? If breasts are at high risk for cancer, then the best prevention is removing the at-risk tissue. And so that's risk-reducing surgery, right? For again, BRCA1, these women are at high risk for ovarian cancer, right? We don't have good imaging surveillance. We're not good at identifying ovarian cancer when it's early and treatable. So for these women, we recommend instead risk-reducing surgery. So removing their ovaries and their fallopian tubes when they're finished having children, often between the ages of 35 and 45, in that range, okay, depending upon the condition. And then similarly, they can be at high risk for endometrial cancer. And so often at the time of removing ovaries and tubes, the doctors talk to women about perhaps removing their uterus as well after having children when they don't need it anymore, right? So those are our women-centric prevention strategies and surveillance strategies. For guys, BRCA1 off switch guys are at high risk for prostate cancer. And so what we do is we start testing their PSA blood test every year at age 40, okay? And then finally, both men and women are at high risk for pancreatic cancer, okay? If they have an off switch in BRCA. And so we offer pancreatic cancer surveillance, which, like breast cancer surveillance, is imaging. It's something called an MRCP, which is an MRI of the pancreas, alternating every 6 months with something called an endoscopic ultrasound, which is a fiber optic tube that goes down the mouth, through the esophagus, through the stomach, into the small intestine, and then into the pancreas, so that the camera can actually look to make sure it's crazy, right? To make sure that the pancreas is fine. And, don't worry, people are knocked out, right?
You're not awake when this happens.
You're not awake, right?
Having a conversation.
Yes. And so, to me, I have to say that there's such hubris in medicine, right? Somebody had the good idea, let's see if we can do this, right? And then they did it, and it works, and of course it saves lives, right? And that's amazing. But, those are the sorts of things that we can do for someone who is predisposed to cancers because of an off switch in BRCA1, okay? So, and I just wanted to sort of highlight this because this is an ever-evolving field. Our knowledge about prevention changes all the time. And this pancreatic cancer surveillance that we were just describing, in fact, it was only definitively proven to be helpful in saving lives about 2 months ago, okay? And this is the definitive figure from the paper that showed it. What's shown over here is stage of detection for people with pancreatic cancer who either did or did not have the surveillance that we were talking about. And what you can see is that if you look at people who had surveillance as compared to people who didn't have surveillance were diagnosed at a later stage, meaning when the cancer is larger and therefore harder to treat. People who did have surveillance were diagnosed at an earlier stage when the cancer is easier to treat. Okay, and remember, this is pancreatic cancer, which is one of the most difficult cancers to treat that we know. And then if we actually look at outcome over here, this is how long do people survive, okay, after they've started after, if they are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. What you can see is that among individuals who didn't have this surveillance, survival was terrible. It was 5 or 10% over 10 or 11 years, okay, so that's terrible. If you look at people who did have the surveillance, it's much, much higher, right? And that's really important. Better quality of life, much longer survival, surveillance works, okay? And this is just the most recent example of that, okay? So that's the utility of genetic testing. Now let's talk about what genetic testing actually is, okay? So as we said, of the 22,000 genes that exist in each of us, only somewhere between 40 and 100 are important in defending against cancer, right? And the idea is that if one of those genes has an off switch, if you turn off a gene that's important in defending against cancer, then it would make sense that a person's risk of cancer development would be increased. And that's the logic behind a genetic test, okay? What we do is what's called panel testing, which means that we look at actual subsets, large subsets of these 40 to 100 genes, and we're not limited to doing one gene at a time, okay? And it's important because, as we were saying, if we find something, it matters not just for a person, but also for their family members. 50% of an individual's first-degree relatives, meaning parents, siblings, and children, will also carry that same predisposition. Okay, so the knowledge really does matter for families and for individuals. Okay, and what's allowed us to actually do this sort of work is sort of illustrated here. Okay, and this is kind of a funky figure. It's based on something called Moore's Law, which came from a guy who was the founder of Intel back in the 60s. And what he said was that the capacity of chips doubles every 2 years, while the cost of chips halves every 2 years. And so if you take the time from when the very first genome was sequenced, which is about the year 2000, and use this rule of thumb that has become so important for computers, right? This is what the cost of sequencing a person's genome should be, right? This is the actual green, is the actual reality. And the point here is that over time, through improvements in technology, the cost of sequencing has plummeted, right? And that's been super important in increasing the availability, right? Accessibility of genetic testing to all of us, right? Cost is really important. And this reflects just where we are now. We actually have now a genome for $100, which is mind-boggling, right? The other thing that's really been a game changer in terms of making panel genetic testing available is, believe it or not, the Supreme Court ruling, okay? The first genetic company, genetic testing company that became really well-known and really did a lot of the work was a company called Myriad. Myriad thought that genetic testing was a great business because they felt that if they could patent our genes, then no one else could perform testing and they could charge through the nose, right? Well, it turns out that there was a case that went before the Supreme Court that appropriately ruled that you can't patent the gene, right? Genes are all of us, right? And they're just not patentable because they are us, right? And so the patent that Myriad had was struck down. And what that meant was that other companies could enter the genetic testing landscape and compete with Myriad. And in this case, competition turned out to be a good thing. Cost plummeted, service improved, it became easy to actually perform a genetic test. And so this confluence of decreased cost and increased competition made possible the modern world in which we live, in which genetic testing is cheap, easy, and affordable for everyone, okay, and covered by insurance, okay? So now let's talk about who should have testing, right? What we as a field have really spent a lot of time agitating over is, can we define criteria to identify people who are most likely to have a predisposition, okay? And, a lot of that mindset really came from the era when genetic testing was hard, expensive, right? And, wasn't widely available as it is today. So we thought about criteria, right? And they were, if a person has more than one different cancer, right? Well, maybe that person is predisposed to develop cancers, and maybe that person should then have genetic testing. If a person has a cancer that occurs earlier in age than is typical, right? Maybe that is the result of an inherited predisposition. If we have lots of family members in one side of the family, right, all sharing the same bloodline, well, maybe that's a clue that there's an inherited predisposition, and so on, okay? And so using these criteria became sort of standard in the field to sort of determine who should or should not have genetic testing. Then in 2000, I think it was 14, this paper came out that was really eye-opening to a lot of us in the field. And in this paper, what the authors did was they took 1,000 consecutive Ashkenazi Jewish women, this was done in New York City, who were diagnosed with breast cancer. They offered them genetic testing, panel testing, and they asked whether they had inherited predispositions, right? And it turns out that about 15% had an inherited predisposition that was identified in this experiment, right? But what was really crazy was that while half of the people who had an inherited predisposition did in fact meet criteria, right? Had something that was a red flag that would suggest that they should have genetic testing, half of the people didn't, right? And that was really surprising, right? But if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? We think about our families, right? People don't necessarily talk about cancer. People don't necessarily know, right? People hide things, right? People are embarrassed, right? People who get hit by a bus at 30 may not develop a cancer at 50, right? So for lots of reasons, the criteria that we had used to guide who should have testing, we realized were actually not working, right? Not identifying people who needed genetic testing to help guide their care, okay? And as the use of genetic testing to guide treatment for cancer patients became increasingly evident, right? And increasingly necessary, these criteria have sort of fallen by the wayside. And in fact, it turns out that yes, we pay attention to criteria, but now, in 2024, thanks to studies like the one that we just looked at, it turns out that the recommendations, the guidelines, are anyone diagnosed with any of these cancers should have genetic testing. So now at Roswell, any woman diagnosed with breast cancer has genetic testing as part of her initial workup. Same with ovarian cancer, so on and so forth, okay? Because it matters, right? And so we do it, okay? So now just a word about, the things that we were talking about earlier, which is cost and insurance, okay? Competition. There are a set of laboratories that are the most common laboratories that people use for genetic testing. The truth is, there's really no difference one to the next, and the tests that are performed are very similar one to the next, okay? So, a laboratory is really not that important, okay, in terms of thinking about genetic testing. But what is important is service and interfacing with insurance and cost, right? And all of these companies have taken on interfacing with insurance, so they bill the insurance. So it's a very simple, painless process, right? There isn't this requirement for paperwork and proof and pleading with insurance and pleading with payers, so on and so forth anymore, because of the recognition of the importance of genetics. And, we were talking about the cost of sequencing. Well, it's come way down, right? So even for people who, choose not to have insurance cover the cost of testing for whatever reason, it turns out that there really is a maximum price that these companies charge, which is about $249. They all have, and that's it, right? So it's not thousands of dollars, right? That's the most that anyone will have to pay, right? And then all the companies have financial assistance programs, which in general is comprised of two questions, which they don't verify. And the two questions are, how many people live in your home and what's your household income? That's it. And so my advice is, if somebody chooses to have genetic testing and one of the laboratory calls to say something about cost, say that there's 60 of us and our annual household income is about $20. Done, right? It's really that simple. So the bottom line is that now very few patients pay anything out of pocket at all, okay? And so the testing is easy and useful, right? It's meaningful, okay? So the first step in the process of having genetic testing is a meeting with a genetic counselor or other genetic professional to get education and to give informed consent. So informed consent is really important, because what it means is that a person who's having the test performed understands what it is, understands what the risks and the benefits are, and agrees, okay? Understanding as well the limitations, okay? So these are the different elements of informed consent. And the one that I think is really important and worth highlighting is a question that everyone asks, right? What happens with the information? Can it be used against me, right? Can I be denied X because of my genetics? And the answer is no. And the reason is a federal law called GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act. And what that law does, that federal law does, is it makes it a federal crime to discriminate against a person on the basis of their genetics, right? So you can't be denied a job, right? You can't be denied health insurance, right? Health insurance is specifically protected by GINA, okay? So there are safeguards in place to protect people who have genetic testing, right? And that's really important, right? Federal crime, New York State is actually a great state in terms of protecting individual rights. So there are even further state laws to protect people against any form of genetic discrimination. And so I think that's super important to highlight, right? Because you're protected, right? At least until the next Trump administration. And so how does genetic testing work? So remember, DNA is DNA is DNA, right? So we typically use a blood sample or a spit sample, right? There are cells that are in your spit, right? The only thing that's important is that if we use spit, it's collected more than 30 minutes after you eat something, because otherwise we might learn that you're in fact a hot dog. And that's probably not a good thing to learn, right? So you collect a sample, you fragment the DNA, and that's just done in the laboratory. And then you use these magnetic beads to specifically select the parts of the DNA sequence that you're interested in sequencing. So the magnetic beads recognize specific genetic sequences, they bind to them, you pull down the beads, you release the DNA from the beads, and then you just sequence those fragments. And what you do is you build out, using the different fragments and overlaying the fragments like a jigsaw puzzle, a map of the genes that you sequence. And then you compare a person's sequence to a reference gene. And you ask, are there changes that are off switches? Remember, we know we're going to find changes, right? But we're looking specifically for changes that are off switches for any one of those genes. Okay.
Wait.
Yes, sir.
When you draw the blood at Roswell, what you just described, is that done by Roswell or is that done by the company that the blood work is sent to?
It depends.
Okay.
In some cases, for some situations, it's done at Roswell, and in others, it's done by the company. Most commonly, it's done by the company. Most commonly, will draw the blood or collect the spit and then send it to the company. And, the idea is that they're doing it a gazillion times a day, right? So there's this economy of scale, right? Okay, but it varies on different settings. Okay. So, once a genetic test is performed, there are three types of results. There's a positive result, and what that means is that an off switch has been detected. There's a negative. There is a negative result, which means that we've looked, and yes, we found variants, but none of them are off switches, okay? And then finally, there's a variant of uncertain significance. And that's a result that maybe hasn't been seen before, right? Or maybe in computer models has predicted to do something, right? We don't know what, but something, let's say, right? And we don't have enough information to say yes or no, that this is a pathogenic variant or not, an off switch or not, okay? And we're going to talk about that in just a couple of minutes. So what do each of these three different types of results mean? A positive result means that we've found something. In general, we know a lot about the genes that are associated with an increase in cancer risk, this set of 4,200 genes, and we have action plans. We have things that we can do medically, right, to help people and families stay safe, right? It is true, sometimes we learn things that are surprising. If we're testing 50, 70 genes, right? And we routinely do 71 genes at the same time at Roswell. Sometimes we learn things that we weren't looking for, right? So if we think about breast cancer genes, there's ballpark 25 to 30 genes that are associated specifically with an increased risk for breast cancer. If we're looking at 70 genes, then some of the genes that we're looking at aren't breast cancer genes. And sometimes we uncover predispositions that we didn't know we were looking for, right? But those results have meanings for the family, right? Because remember, we said half the time there's no clue, right? So finding things has meaning for families, okay? Oops, uh-oh. I guess, let's see if we can fix that. I'm sure the answer is yes. So that's a positive result, A negative result means that we've looked at the genes and we didn't find a positive result. Again, we know we're going to find variants, right? Because variants are everywhere. There are 10 to 30 million of them. But we didn't find a variant that, turned off a gene that we know defends against cancer. But, there are mysteries, right? We performed a test because maybe there's a family aggregation of cancer, right? Maybe there are, many people in the family that have cancers, right? So a negative result isn't the same thing as no genetic predisposition, right? Or no familial predisposition. So remember, cancer is most commonly the result of genetic factors and non-genetic factors, genes and environment that act and interact. And if we think about people who live in families, right, they share the same environment, right? And so it could be, so for example, this is Buffalo. Let's say a family lives on Love Canal, right? Even in the absence of a genetic predisposition, that shared environment may be associated with an increased risk for cancer in families, right? It's important to think there are also chance events. We think about breast cancer. We know that over the course of their lives, 1 in 8 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer. And so the co-occurrence of breast cancer in 2 or 3 women in a single family, just by chance, happens, right? And so we shouldn't discount the contribution to what is apparently family aggregation, or just chance events, right? So there are possible reasons that tests can be negative, right? Even in the face of an apparently genetic appearing, right, family. And don't forget, there are genes that we don't know yet, right? And so genes that aren't being tested for it. So this VUS result. So this is where, when we think of, this is where it's important to think about where we started, which is that map of different regions and ancestries. So it turns out that the vast majority of variants of uncertain significance that get identified through genetic testing are actually just reflections of ancestry that maybe haven't been sequenced before and or maybe haven't been come across before, right? And so what we've learned is that the vast majority of time, as we learn more about these variants of uncertain significance and we learn enough to reclassify them as positive or negative, it turns out that over 90% of the time, they get reclassified as negative, okay? And so because we know that in most cases, they're completely unimportant, we don't use them to make clinical decisions. Now, I want to highlight here something that is really a problem, okay? So if we think about sequencing, what genomes have we sequenced? Well, they're largely individuals of European ancestry, and specifically Northern European ancestry. So Germans, England, Wales, right? We have tons of knowledge of the genomes, right, of individuals of those ancestries. And so we have proportionately fewer of these variants of uncertain significance. For individuals who are not of Northern European ancestry, we have a lot less information. And so what that means is that the likelihood of finding a variant of uncertain significance is much higher. And again, it's a reflection of ancestry and lack of knowledge. So, disparities in health and genetic health are important because of lack of knowledge, right? We just don't know things about people who are not of European ancestry enough yet, okay? And so I really want to highlight the variants of uncertain significance because they've been something that have plagued geneticists and oncologists and surgeons for decades. Because there's this feeling, oh, well, this is a variant of uncertain significance. Let's be conservative and act on it, right? And in fact, that's the wrong answer, okay? And it's really important to understand that variants of uncertain significance are almost never important. And so, in fact, the right answer is don't act on it, okay? So now let's talk about genetic medicine. So we talked about genetic testing, right? But I would argue that's really just the first step, right? We perform the test so that we can do something about it. And, that's the point, right? It's just the beginning, right? And let's think about what we mean, right? So we've already talked about knowledge as power, having information about genetic predisposition being important for preventing cancer or catching it when it's at its earliest and most treatable stage. We've already talked about genetic testing as important for guiding therapy for cancer patients, right? For family members, right? So when we think about it, really genetic testing is actionable and it's about prevention and wellness, right? That's really what this is all about, okay? And so that's medicine and not just testing. So testing unlinked for medicine is a failed opportunity, right? And just to sort of underscore what we're talking about, let's just run through the numbers, okay? So what we know is that in the world, 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women will be diagnosed with cancer at some point in their lives. If we look at people who have cancer, 7 to 10% of all people who are diagnosed with cancer have an inherited predisposition to cancer. Obviously matters for them and matters for their family, right? But the 7 to 10% isn't the same across all types of cancers. Some types of cancers, like liver cancer, are really not very genetic. Other cancers, like breast cancer, ovarian cancer, pancreatic, prostate, some GU cancers, so bladder cancer, kidney cancer, colon cancer, endometrial cancer, sarcomas, and other rare types of cancer are very highly genetic. So a very significant proportion of patients with these different types of cancers have an inherited predisposition, okay? Then, if we think about not people with cancer, but people in the world, right? Stick with women, right? What we know is that women who are at high risk for cancer using what are called risk models, okay? These are things that are age, height, weight, breast density, age of first period, age of first live birth, and then family history on the mom and dad side, you sort of plug them in and you come up with a lifetime risk estimate for breast cancer. It turns out that women who are at high risk for breast cancer get standard of care covered by insurance, no questions asked, a genetic evaluation and genetic testing. And even if they test negative because they're high risk, they get what's called high risk surveillance, which is this alternating breast MRI and mammogram, right? 1 every 6 months. Okay. So the question is then, what proportion of women on planet Earth are high risk? Well, guess what? It's 20%. 1 out of 5 women walking on this planet is high risk for breast cancer and should have a genetic evaluation just as part of routine care, right? And that's crazy, right? That is a lost opportunity for us to change people's lives, change families' lives, right? And that is part of what we're aspiring to do at Roswell with this new department that we started. It's not just focus on people with cancer, but to focus on everyone, right? Genetics is for all of us. If we think about Roswell Park, this sort of underscores the numbers, right? Roswell sees 10,000 patients each year who are newly diagnosed with cancer. So remember, this is 1 year, right? Half of them, based on what we just discussed, should have genetic testing just as part of their routine initial workup for their cancer diagnosis, right? 20% of that 5,000 will be positive for something. That's 1,000 people a year, right? Each of those 1,000 people is going to have, let's just say, 4 close family members, parents, siblings, kids in the Buffalo area, right? All 4 of them need to have genetic testing. Half of them are going to be positive. So what that means is that there's going to be another 2,000 people who are at high risk for cancer because of their genetics and need to be cared for. This is each year, right? And so if we think about it, 9,000 people each year need genetic testing. 3,000 each year will need ongoing care based upon their genetics. And of course, that doesn't include the 15 to 20% of all women who are high risk. So the role of cancer genetics, the role of this department is incredibly important, and it touches all parts, not just of Roswell, but of Western New York. Okay.
You think this will be a standard test? Like taking your cholesterol, but you're also going to be tested for genetic. Do you see that in the
So
future?
I do, with a caveat. And the caveat is that it's not okay, in my opinion, for someone to just offer a test without having a trained professional as a safety net to help interpret it. Okay. And so that's actually what we did. That's our innovation, right? What we did was we empowered our partners in breast surgery and gynec and whatever to perform the test. But then we required that anyone who has a positive or a variant of uncertain result has to be sent to us, right? And so the idea is that what we're doing is we're building out a system that is in a jargon, in the vernacular that doctors understand. Doctors know how to order tests and they know how to place referrals. That's all we're asking them to do, right? And it works, right? Because it's set up in their mindset, okay? So that's what we're doing. And that's how I think it can become broadly, yes.
I just have a question. So you said when they test you for the BRCA1 and BRCA2, that can discover a genetic predisposition for breast cancer. I think you listed, you had said like 4 different.
Breast, ovarian, pancreas.
Yes.
Right.
So are they testing for all of that, or are they specifically only testing for just one predisposition or any of those?
So we're doing panel testing. We're looking actually at 71 genes, okay? And so we're casting a broad net, but we're casting a narrow enough net so that what we find becomes actionable, right? They're predispositions that matter, but that what we know what to do, we know how to deal with them, right? Does that make sense?
It does. I was just curious. I had the testing, but that was like 13 years ago, so
Yeah.
I have no clue what they looked for.
Right, and 13 years ago, it wouldn't be unreasonable to retest because there are many more genes that we know of that are associated with breast cancer and other cancers. And even for genes like BRCA1 or BRCA2 that were part of the very early tests, what we've learned is that there are types of variants that we weren't able to identify, even as recently as 2017, that we can now identify. And so what we really do is recommend people who've had testing before about 2017 to consider retesting, okay? Because the technology, the knowledge is so much better.
So you just mentioning to your doctor that you want to be retested, is that it?
I'm sorry, say it again?
You just mentioned to your doctor that you want to be, the BRCA test, you want to be done again?
Yeah.
That's all you have to do?
And then, if your doctor is at Roswell, they'll probably send you to us. Okay? And we'll help them, right?
Oh,
Okay.
What's the more advanced test? Is it next
Excuse me?
test or something?
Sorry.
What's the name of the test after you have the basic or you tested?
Right.
Next test?
Cancer Next, right?
What's
Isn't that the
Oh,
panel test?
So Cancer Next is the name of the Ambry
Yeah.
panel test that we use, right?
So is that the latest one that's out?
Well, Cancer Next is sort of Ambry's global name
Oh,
for their tests.
Okay.
They, everything is a next for them because they want to pretend that they're sort of cutting edge and all of that. So it's not just the current, but it's the next generation of tests, right?
But would Roswell call us and say there's a new test out there?
No.
Come in and get tested?
No. it
We
wouldn't.
have to be proactive.
Yeah, that's right. And that's part of why it's so important for me to get the word out, right? Because people need to know what, and this is largely part of the way that genetics has worked historically. So historically, genetics has been the purview of genetic counselors, right? People who educate, obtain informed consent, and then explain the results. But they're not providers. They're not people who can care for patients, right? And so now that we have a medicalized version of the clinical genomics department, we care for families for life. Okay? And so that's changing what we're describing. But the counselors, just by virtue of the nature of their work, right, have typically told people, here are your results, this is what it means. And we recommend that you check in with us every year or every 2 years to see if there are updates.
So then we would call our genetic counselor that we met the last time to see.
So you just call the main number and then you come to us, okay? And our counseling team would start with, exploring whether there's any value in the retesting. And then they would perform the test, obviously with the consent. Okay?
So do you need a referral? Can you just call? or-
You can actually go to the website and sign up, and then a member of our patient access team will call. Okay, now, I started in June, okay, and we are rapidly growing, right? So we're hiring a whole slew of new counselors, and we're hiring other doctors and other medical professionals to care for people who have positive results. But right now, there is still, as there historically has been, a delay. So if you just sign up, it could be X amount of time before you're actually seen, okay? And we are hiring people so that we can get rid of that, because there shouldn't be barriers, right? This should be something like everything else that's done quickly, right? We're getting there. We're not there yet. Okay. But so, that's cancer risk at Roswell. And so the numbers are enormous. And the goal is access and care coordination. What we aspire to do is to be a medical home for patients and families who are at increased risk for cancer because of their genetics. The way that we've set up the department is that we have here 2 services. The counseling service, which is for people who want to have genetic testing, and then the medicine service, which is for people who've had testing and have a positive result, we care for them, okay? And then we partner with our counseling colleagues to get family members tested. So the idea is that it's this virtuous cycle of testing, care, family members, right? Or of course, people from the community, because we want to serve everyone, okay? And if you think about our mission statement, it's to be a cancer wellness medical specialty home. The idea is that cancer risk, again, is about prevention, knowledge, and wellness, right? So that is our mantra, and we want to be, we aspire to be, we are the medical home, right? We are the source of truth. We integrate care, we ensure that every patient and every family has what they need, right? And it's crazy because, believe it or not, no one else in the world is doing this. Every other place in the world has genetic counselors, but this idea of a medical home, the what next, the now what, we're in, right? So it's an example of something I'm actually very proud of. It's an example of Roswell really leading the way for what I think will be standard of care in not very long, because it's so obvious, right? You know, this is what we should be doing, right? We make the diagnosis, we care for people. Simple, right? And so this is the idea, right? We become the center of gravity, the source of truth, the coordinators among our various high-risk domain experts. So throughout Roswell, we have specialists in different body parts, right? And they are part of our department. And for people who have specific risks, we refer to them, but we oversee the overall care, and we ensure that all parts of a person and a family's care talk to each other, okay? So really what we're doing is becoming a medical home dedicated to wellness and prevention. And of course, now that I'm in Buffalo, I think of things in terms of football. And so I become the Josh Allen of a person or a family's team, right? We're the quarterback, and again, we're the first of our kind in the country, okay? So I know that it's getting late, so I won't belabor the point, but the idea is what we were saying earlier. This is patient and family centered, but it's set up in a way that doctors understand. So it becomes easy for doctors to collaborate with us, to refer patients to us, and for us to send patients back for ongoing care, okay? This is just what we were talking about in terms of empowering our colleagues throughout Roswell to order tests, right? So a patient sees a breast surgery provider. The breast surgeon needs the information so that she or he can best take care of that patient newly diagnosed with breast cancer. And so they show the patient a video, they order the test. If the tests are negative, then the surgeon just does whatever it is that the surgeon does. If the results are positive, then they use that information to guide their upfront care, but then they also refer the patient to us for all other components of cancer genetics and cancer risk care. And we work with our counselors to get the family members tested, and then we care for the patients and their families for life. So it's really a wonderful, unique system that really allows us to partner throughout Roswell. You know, again, prevention and wellness, right? That's what we're all about. That's the mantra, okay? Who should be seen by us? Pretty much anyone, right? This is anyone who has a genetic test result that's positive or variant of uncertain significance. We can help explain the results. Anyone who has a family history, whether or not they've had genetic testing, because of course we'll test them, okay? And anyone who would benefit from a genetic evaluation, genetic testing. So we're here to help. That's how we see ourselves, right? The team is comprised of exactly what you would hope: doctors, counselors, advanced practice practitioners, nurse practitioners and physician assistants, navigators, our subspecialists, and so on and so forth, right? And importantly, I forgot to mention this earlier. Cancer prevention, cancer wellness is not just about checking the surveillance boxes, but it's checking the wellness boxes. So there are all these other components of cancer wellness, cancer prevention that are just built into the, you should excuse the expression, the DNA of our program. Ha 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 ha. That's a genetics joke. Okay. And of course, social work. Okay. So I don't have to, I hope, go through the benefits to you. I hope it's self-evident. What I'm a researcher as well as a clinician. And so what I really want is to not just care for people, but to care for people better. And that means knowledge, right? And so what I see us as doing is partnering with our families to learn and give back. And that's across the range of research areas, right? From straight up hardcore genetics, discovery science, statistics, the stuff that we do in the lab, to everything else, right? Implementation science. How do we do this in different contexts, right? How do we do it in an urban context? How do we do it in a rural context, someone who lives 6 hours away, right? How do we ensure that what we're building, this longitudinal home, is open to everyone, right? That's really important, right? And so part of the way that I met Rob was, at Roswell, we have a community outreach and engagement department, right? And when I came to Roswell, the first thing that I wanted to do was make sure that everyone would be involved, so I asked for help. And so I presented to the community advisory board the vision and asked for help. And I'm doing the same here today, right? This is what we're trying to do. If any of you have thoughts or want to help, I'd love help, right? Because we have to make sure that this isn't just the purview of the privilege, right? That's incredibly important. And again, highlighting that, those are core missions of our research program.
Can I ask a question? Because I had genetic testing about a year ago. And when I first was diagnosed, and that they said I didn't qualify to get genetic testing because I'm the first person in my family that had breast cancer. So then after whatever, the girl said, well, let me see if we can fix it that you can get it. I did end up getting it. So I don't go to Roswell. Does the rest of the doctors and all that know now that you can do this?
Yes.
That's because
That's
they're telling
exactly
you you can't get tested.
And to use a phrase that's all the vague, it's
Yeah.
misinformation, right? Because you can, right?
Mhm.
And it can be done. And what we're in the process of doing is this point of care testing, the breast surgeons and so on. We're rolling that out throughout Roswell right now, department by department, ensuring that each department understands how to do this, why to do this, and in fact, that it's only beneficial for the patients, especially because we as the safety net are there to help make sure that the results are interpreted in a way that's meaningful, right? And used in a way that's helpful, okay? So your point is really important, okay? And it's something that we pay a lot of attention to, okay? And so just a real world example, this is the pedigree that we were looking at before at the very beginning. The way that pedigrees work are that circles are girls, squares are boys. These vertical connectors are biological siblings. These horizontal connectors are biological parents. Slashes represent people who have passed away in a family. And the filled in circles are people in a family who've had different types of cancers, okay? So we saw a patient, now this is lightly edited to protect the family's identity, okay? We saw a patient who at age 38 was diagnosed with breast cancer. She had genetic testing, and it turned out that she was positive for our friend for tonight, BRCA1. So she has her dad and her mom, right? We don't know from what side of the family the BRCA1 off switch, the pathogenic variant, came from, right? It could be the mom's side, it could be the dad's side, and we don't know, right? Now, what we did know though was that her father's sister had been diagnosed with breast cancer at age 42 and also had genetic testing. And lo and behold, she was positive as well for exactly the same variant, which of course makes sense because these are tracking within families, right? So if our patient is positive and her father's sister is positive, what does that tell us? It tells us that her father's sister inherited the variant that our patient had from one of her parents, right? And what that means then is that each of her siblings have that same 50-50 chance of inheriting the same variant. So what that tells us is that her father, who didn't have cancer, was an obligate carrier, right? He had to have the variant for our patient to have inherited, right? And so we tested him, and in fact, he was positive, right? So then, sorry? Okay, right. So then, we turn to our patient's aunt's children, okay? If she has the variant, then each of the two has an independent 50-50 chance of inheriting the same pathogenic variant. So we tested them, and it turned out her son was positive and her daughter was negative. But with this information, we're able to care for the family. Her daughter being negative means that her daughter is not at increased risk for cancer and doesn't need all of the surveillance or all of the other interventions that we recommend for family members that are positive. Now, there's still two sisters in the family who have not had genetic testing. And so we're working with them to get them tested so that our knowledge can be used to keep them safe, okay? And this is what we do. This is how testing and medicine, right, working together can change families, right? So takeaway points. Again, we won't belabor it, right? Cancer genetics, cancer risk isn't just about testing, it is about medicine, right? It's about care coordination. It's building a medical home for patients and families to be safe, okay? Half of all patients diagnosed with cancer, just by virtue of the commonness of certain types of cancers, should have testing because it matters, right? Thanks to new technologies, testing is available, accessible, and affordable, right? Patients, providers can perform point of care testing and refer patients to us. We're happy to take care of anyone, irrespective of where the testing takes place. So, we become the cancer risk home, but we're not taking patients from other doctors, we're collaborating with them, right? We have an area of expertise that helps our friends and partners better take care of their patients, right? So we are a home, right? And so the vision is to go from a world where we are now, where cancer risk is ad hoc and, sort of disjointed, to a world where it's just integrated, as you said, into routine care, and it's used to stratify people and families based upon their risk. That's where we're headed, okay? And that's my vision. And thank you very much. And I'm sorry.
Exactly today, and that was really awesome, and I truly admire that, only because in my instance, I know that it's so hard for me to try and go back and figure out what happened, like I never knew either of my grandmothers, they were passed away,
This is families, right? People don't talk to their sister, right? Sister moves to Pittsburgh, God forbid, right? Or New Mexico or California, right? People lose touch with each other, right? And that's just the way we work, right? So information gets lost, right? And degraded over time, right? And so to say, oh, well, we need to pay attention to these arbitrary rules that were designed to maximize the likelihood of a positive result, this is too much, right? We can't help enough people if we're only trying to work towards a positive result, right? It has to be available broadly so that we capture everyone needs our help, okay? And that's a completely different way of thinking. Oh, yes.
I just want to say, it gives a lift to my heart to see how genetic testing has come so much to the forefront and is encouraged. Because I was diagnosed in 79,
Yeah.
and they said if I would have genetic testing and something was wrong, I would immediately lose all my insurance. So,
Completely different, right? Yeah,
so
and
I think it's great.
it's phenomenal, and, and this, this is why I believe in government, right? Government is good, government can protect us, right? And, these laws are here to protect us. So,
AI in any of your.
absolutely.
So if you found X to be advantageous for you.
It's, it's AI is a business, right? AI is not iPhones, right? It's inescapable. And so absolutely, it's helpful, it's useful, and it's pointing us in new directions.
Self. And when you do genetic testing at Roswell, do you get access to our information? Or do you give you permission to use it?
Yes, permission.
So they like.
That's right.
We don't, it's, the blanket.
We can use information that is important for guiding clinical care, but for research, we need your permission.
Okay, yeah, well, we gave it, I don't know.
Yes.